This is Becoming Inclusive from the Kaleidoscope Group, where we're thinking differently about diversity, equity, and inclusion for more empowered people at work. We're committed to real change, and that begins with real conversations. Welcome in.
Welcome to Becoming Inclusive. I'm Reggie Ponder, one of your hosts, and I'm also joined by Catherine Potts, who is the other host for this. This week, we are excited because I get to talk to this guy when I get to talk to him. He's been really busy lately, but when I get to talk to him, we have these just riveting discussions, and I'm so glad that he took the time out to talk with us today. And this is Joe Gaspero. He is the executive consultant at Kaleidoscope Group, but also the CEO and co-founder at the Center for Healthcare Innovation. Welcome, Joe.
Well, Reggie, it's great to see you again. I'm glad to be back, and thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Great to see you as well, Kat.
Yep, happy to have you.
And so, Joe, offline, you and I, man, we get into so many different discussions. I don't even know if we can get into it all here. But today, you brought up something that I thought was really, really interesting, and I think our audience will find it interesting too. So as we welcome you in, we want to welcome our audience in as well to talk about the importance of diversity in leadership position. Before we even get started about that, it seems to me, Joe, that when we talk about diversity in leadership positions, that intuitively, it just kind of makes sense. So what's the problem? Why are we really talking about this? And why are we still talking about this in 2021? I get your take on that.
Well, that's a great question, considering there's been, decades of empirical evidence that supports, diverse teams and being more profitable and more successful by, just about any measurable. But I think this has particular importance over the last 2 years, as the U.S. has really had sobering conversations and reckoning around systemic inequities and racism in the U.S., as we've seen from fallout from George Floyd, as well as just devastating COVID disparities. Corporate America has really turned their attention to this problem that's been a very pervasive and acute problem in our society for a long time. And I think specifically when you look at leadership positions for corporate America and organizations, that's where you see that the diversity tends to be at its least. And so a famous statistic is, there's typically more Fortune 500 CEOs named John or Bob than there are women in any given year. I think right now in 2021, we have a total of 2 CEOs. And throughout the entire history of the Fortune 500 list, there's been only 18 CEOs who are identified as Black. And really that peak number was, and the Fortune 500 list was in 2012 when there was 6 Black men that made that list. So I think just looking at corporate America as a microcosm of what's happening in broader society, I think that's very indicative. I also think that as the U.S. continues to tackle this problem and organizations commit to this, we really need to see that diversity and at the boardroom and CEO level, and really in those leadership positions, because those are the key decision makers that are really driving the organization and making those key strategic decisions that ultimately impact the organization. And I think we see the most just alarming statistics when we look at really boardrooms and C-suites of corporations in America.
So, Joe, where do you see companies starting? Where could they begin trying to address that?
That's a great question. I think, just making a commitment, I think starting with board members, as organizations try to develop plans and strategies for becoming more diverse, I think having individuals on the board that can help drive those decisions and offer management the strategic input is important. I think it's important for any organization to have a really robust and strong mentoring and sponsorship program, right? So this is important, thinking about grooming the next generation of leaders. We see a lot of attention from organizations focusing on hiring, recruiting, attracting people of color and other marginalized groups. But that mentorship component is really important in sponsorship and professional development to make sure that organizations are grooming diverse leaders from within their ranks.
So Joe, here's my problem, is that I believe that diversity matters. However, there are some businesses that are doing pretty darn well. And I talked to Chris Georges about this at some point as well, that there's some businesses doing pretty darn well. And I think that what they would say, I know what they would say is, why do I need to change? I'm not really sure why you're telling me, am I changing for political correctness? Am I changing for the environment's sake? Why do I need to change when we are doing well? And the other thing that I think people really, really push back on, I know I got a lot to say on this one, is that when we talk about diversity, it's either racial or ethnic diversity, and it makes some folks upset. And I think rightfully so, because they're saying we're not all the same either. We're diverse. So you're discounting that even though we have white men on the board, that we're diverse. We come from diverse places. We have diverse experiences, but you want to just kind of lump us in. And I think that that's unfair. Any thoughts on that?
Well, let me answer the first part, which I think directly relates to the second. So, one might ask, well, why do we need to change? Things are going well the way they are. Well, look at demographics in America, and people often think that like there's some impending demographic shift that's years off. And no, it's happening. In fact, in 20 years from now, by the year 2043, half of America will be people of color. So I think, just from that basic standpoint is just prepping for the future. What do consumers and customers look like no matter what business you're in? So demographics in the US are really rapidly and profoundly changing. So while you may be doing well now, I think it's important to look at the future. And I think that's always, that should really be the lead foot in this when it comes to diversity. It should really be about, as an organization, how can we better sell our products or services to the market? And so viewing it from that angle, it might be a little bit different than viewing it from maybe a more altruistic angle or saying, hey, we should get more diverse because it's the right thing to do. We know the right thing to do changes over time and it's subjective, but just, purely looking at what's happening in America from just a demographic lens, we're going through these greater and more dramatic demographic shifts than we've ever seen. And so let me answer the second part by saying—
really quick, Joe, I'm wondering too, I understand the importance of sort of like the why, right? But some also may ask, what is it? And by what is it going to do for me? What's the business impact for me wanting to look at this more and look at this more closely and make more changes than what I'm already doing?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to knowing the market, being able to relate to the marketplace. Let's take boardroom diversity, right? Having those different perspectives and folks that come from different walks of life and different genders, different races, different ethnicities. To answer the second part of your question, Reggie, sure, a group of any 100 homogenous individuals are going to have cognitive diversity within that group, right? But a group of white men just are simply not going to have those experiences of women or people of color or folks in the LGBT community. And I think that, again, that's directly related to those demographics. It just comes down to, I really like to simplify it, just knowing your market. Who are we going to be selling our products to, today and tomorrow? And I think that that's important. And I think, particularly at the boardroom level, having that strategic wisdom, guidance, and input can help organizations prepare for those shifts and ultimately be able to better respond to the needs of a more diverse consumer base.
I was reading, I love that, Joe. I was reading just yesterday. Actually, I was watching something. I've been reading and watching so much, so I can't even remember. I'm getting all confused. But I was watching something where David Oyelowo, the actor, was talking about how they got the movie Selma made. And the way in which he got it made was that he had to fight, and there was a Black executive, I think, there who actually fought for it. So it lends some credence to this, to the thing that you're talking about in terms of having the leadership in those positions, because a lot of times the way that people were looking at what they call Black movies is they look at them as a genre, and Black movies with Black folks are not a genre. It's a movie like any other movie, but be like, well, will people go see that? And you have to have some diverse talent there to say, this is a story just like any other story. Let's put that out there if it's a worthy story. Let's talk about the story worthy, not if the ethnicity of it makes sense per se. So I think that relates to what you're talking about in terms of having that representation there.
Right. And every industry subset, every nook and cranny of the market is different. Take healthcare, for instance, is my area. One of the things that we're seeing in healthcare is, the industry as a whole is trying to make clinical trials more diverse and inclusive, trying to welcome more communities of color into research and clinical trials for drug testing. And so one way to do that is to increase the number of Black physicians or brown physicians or those diverse patients that you're recruiting for clinical trials, having more people of color as primary investigators, research coordinators.
I got to stop you, Joe. You just said something. You said having more Black doctors. Why does that matter? We just have a trial. I just need the Black people to come in and be part of the trial. But you said something about doctors. Say some more, please.
Yep. So the data and statistics show that, in healthcare, most patients prefer to be seen by a physician or nurse that shares their same demographic traits. And so, that's not for everyone, but for the majority. And so as you look at something complex as clinical trials and trying to convince a patient, explain what a clinical trial is, standard of care, why it's important, why participation is important, that can sometimes is done in healthcare where communities of color, and rightfully so, have lower confidence in healthcare and have, historically high levels of mistrust due to a whole litany of factors. And so, just specifically relating it to that example, having physicians that are Black or Latin to be able to relate to those patients that we're trying to recruit, again, patients just feel more comfortable. So, that's an example of where I think, whether it's leadership or board members at healthcare organizations, without having a more diverse leadership and C-suite, the organization might not place an emphasis on trying to develop and recruit and hire more physicians of color or PIs of color or clinical research coordinators. So again, I think it comes down to with a board or C-suite, it's what are our blind spots, right? If we have a very homogenous board of white individuals, again, we're going to be very limited, I think, in terms of what we're going to be able to do if we're selling to the masses.
So would you say, Joe, that having a diverse board, diverse leadership impacts, for example, in healthcare, impacts the experience of the patient, for example, and then what could that do for a hospital, for example? Because if they see, okay, I can relate to this board, right? I see myself on this board. I'm Black. I see someone that's Black on the board. How do you think that affects their experience and how they look at the hospital?
Again, I think that, as I mentioned, as data shows, there's just a greater level of comfort. I think, particularly in something, the specific example I gave with clinical trials, I think there's a unique, historical legacy there. And I think that for, patients of color, really anyone, it's important to be interacting with folks that look and think like us. Healthcare, I think, is no different. And so, while a patient might not, look at the pictures in the hallway of the board chairs, I think organizations that are really taking diversity serious and, have diverse folks in key leadership positions to drive those conversation strategies and tactics that impact patients, I think that's where it really comes to fruition.
I love that, Joe. So the first thing I think that the big takeaway that I get from you firstly is this issue of representation matters, is that we have to have that representation. But I think that you are going further than that and saying that representation is not just to be politically correct, to just have some people here. That representation is to really help the company from a market perspective. And that because demographics are changing, because there might be other business opportunities, that representation should help you from these blind spots. And I love the word that you said, blind spots. So the first is the representation, but the reason the representation is there is to understand these blind spots.
Absolutely. And I would say that, it's not for politically correctness or just to do it because it's, it's in vogue or it's the sign of the times. I think it is important. It's the why. It's an important question. Why do we value diversity? Can we leverage diversity to help us better deliver services or sell our products? Considering that the market is rapidly changing, there always needs to be that intentionality. And I definitely think that, it should be related to the bottom line, quite frankly. I mean, that's why organizations, that's why they exist, or, either the bottom line or if it's nonprofit, the mission or impact. There needs to be some intentionality behind why are we becoming diverse? Why are we trying to, groom executives that might step into C-suite positions or recruit diverse board members? And it comes back to, the market's changing, and some demographics in some markets, it might not has changed rapidly as others. But let's, as an organization, be able to better understand this particular market, who we're serving, demographic changes. And also, I think, having diverse boards and C-suites also helps with organizations, hiring, recruiting, attracting, hiring, and promoting people of color, women, other marginalized groups.
Hey, Joe, you talked about mentorship. And so I'm sort of curious, most companies will do, your annual review, right? That might be your only opportunity to talk about where you're at, where you're going, where you were. What can that look like moving forward to where it's a little bit more impactful? And you are, to what you've said previously, grooming future talent to kind of fit where you're looking for the company to move towards.
Yeah, so I think for a lot of organizations, this could take the shape of employee resource groups or affinity groups where they offer mentoring components. Professional development for any organization is critically important. It's important to always think about the next generation of leaders. Many organizations, those who are best poised to lead the organization are those that are, from within, that know the organization well. So as part of any organization that thinks about, succession planning and professional development of staff, there's going to be good programs in place, such as employee resource groups or different opportunities to mentor executives. And I also think in the lack of any formal mentoring programs, organizations, particularly communities of color or folks from marginalized communities who are in executive positions, who are in key leadership positions, it's important for those folks to make themselves available to others within the organization as well. But I think, mainly organizations need to think about professional development for their staff, and a mentoring component is a great way, especially when you get up the executive level, and mentoring can be, very important. I think that's a great way for organizations to really think about grooming the next generation of leaders from within.
So Joe, all this stuff sounds good, but it's not easy. I'm a tech company. I have 3 founders. It's me and my 2 friends. We're white, young white guys, and we started a business. As the business grows, we hire, we're trying to be the best that we can be, but in our leadership positions, those are the 3 leadership positions we're going to have. We're not going to have anymore. We're not just going to expand our leadership just to expand our leadership. We founded it. It's our baby. So is there any thoughts there from a leadership perspective?
So as organizations grow, I'm assuming revenues are increasing, the organization's getting bigger. So, the founders of an organization are always going to be the same, but as organizations grow, again, I'm going to relate it directly back to the marketplace and having a workforce, executives and board members, and those that comprise the organization somewhat, matching who we're selling our products to. So it's not necessarily about again, creating a position that without intentionality, assuming the organization is going to grow, there's always going to be opportunities to bring in other folks, and particularly diverse folks to help an organization succeed.
And this is where I guess the reason I brought that up, this is where my pet peeve is that in business, when we make business decisions, we sit down and we look at everything and make these tough business decisions. But when it comes to diversity, it seems like we kind of throw our hands up and say, oh, that's difficult to do, or I don't really want to touch that, and really stray away from the business impact. And because this is what you're talking about, the business impact of leadership, of of diversity at the leadership position. And I think we kind of throw that away about the business impact. And that's how come you keep hearing me say, oh, it's a politically correct, it's nice to do, but it's not. It's really, what I'm getting from you is that it's really about the business impact. How can I grow my business? How can I sustain my business? If my demographics are changing, I need to do some things to sustain it. If it's changing, I might need to do some things to get some new customers, all of that type of stuff. And it just seems to really be about business impact.
Yeah, and relating it solely to business impact, I also think gives it more legs in some ways. You think about accountability, right? Measurable metrics, whether we're looking at revenues or whatever you're measuring. I think measuring and holding folks accountable is ultimate. That's how you get things done within an organization. So kind of approaching it from politically correct, or this is the right thing to do, that's fine. And that works, and that could work for a lot of folks. But I think when it really comes to making the case, for sustainability and long-term transformation, yes, it needs to be the business impact. It needs to be understanding that, again, demographics are just rapidly shifting. And in order to be able to respond to these shifts that are, they're already happening, I think it's important for organizations to look at that from the business dimension, from the ability to understand the marketplace and sell goods and products to those consumers.
I love that. Kat.
It just makes me think, in the beginning, Joe, you were talking about how the last 2 years has been a really prevalent topic, right? And we're kind of going into 2022, and there's been a lot of talk around companies, individuals feeling kind of fatigued by this topic, right? How do we keep people motivated, do you think, to continue making this a priority within companies?
Well, I think, that fatigue, from many folks that I've talked to, that's something that people of color and women and folks in marginalized communities, they have to wear that all the time. The fatigue might be new, but it's not new for those that are experiencing that. It might be new for white individuals or for folks that, are having new conversations around race and systemic racism in America. That fatigue thing is, I would, contend that most of, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but, that's something that communities of color have to wear all the time. I'm sure it's very tiring for them. And so we're all a part in racial relations in America, no matter what our race. We're not immune from it. We're a part of it. We're a part of the very complex, social nature of race in America. And so, we should feel fatigued. That means we've been talking about it.
Wow.
I love that. That's amazing.
I do too. I do too, Joe. And so we're kind of rounding around the bend. And so I'm going to put you on the spot, Joe, is if nobody listened to the first 19 minutes of this, and you were to tell them 3 things that you want them to know about the importance of diversity in leadership position, what would be those 3 things that would be important?
I think it's, number one, important to understand that the market and consumers and those that we sell products and services are rapidly changing. Number 2, I think it's important for, as organizations understand that, to look inside the organization and make sure that there's, robust mentoring, employee resource groups, resources within the organization to help groom executives. And then 3, to look outside of the organization as well. And also to think about, the way that we hire and the way that folks hire, and perhaps shifting that from looking at, maybe what someone has accomplished to maybe what they can achieve moving forward based on their lives and their personal experiences. Joe,
look, man, every time I have such a great time talking to you, and we put Kat in the group with us today. I'm so glad that she joined as well. And this whole issue of the importance of diversity in leadership positions, I guess the last point that I'd like to make is that when we talk about diversity, a lot of times, and you made sure that you didn't do this, is a lot of times people look at that as black and white, black people and white people. And you made sure to talk about LGBTQ, women was a big thing you talked about, as well as our Latinx brothers and sisters as well. And it expands beyond that as for sure. But I'm really glad that you talked about it with multiple dimensions, because a lot of times it comes out to this black and white thing, and it's so much more than that.
Yeah, it is. And I relate this again to anybody from a marginalized or underrepresented community.
Excellent. Well, look, the title of this is Becoming Inclusive. And Joe Gaspero talked about today about the importance of diversity in leadership positions. This is only the beginning of that conversation, because there's a lot more. There were some facts and figures that Joe gave us as well. And you were probably like, I didn't catch that. I didn't get that. That's okay. Don't worry about it. We'll have him back on, because maybe we probably need to have one with all the facts and figures. But I didn't want to be so boring just to have facts and figures and facts and figures. But I know for some of you guys, you want to know what those are. Are they? It doesn't become meaningful until you actually see the numbers. And so we'll have Joe back on to talk about that again. I'm Reggie Ponder. That's Joe Gaspero. And that is Catherine Potts. Thank you again for joining Becoming Inclusive, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Becoming Inclusive is presented by the Kaleidoscope Group, your full-service diversity, equity, and inclusion partner serving clients worldwide. Learn more and continue the conversation at kgdiversity.com.